Let's welcome Steve Law.
All right, thank you very much. Well, you just mentioned this series of films. We've created 6 of them centered around the Exodus because it's such a central issue. And the last 2 films that we made cover this issue I'm going to talk about tonight, which is where is the location of Mount Sinai. For some of you, you are very familiar with us, but others might not even have heard of this idea before. But you know, we might want to start with the question, have you ever considered that Mount Sinai may not actually be on the Sinai Peninsula? And to some people that just sounds really weird, and why would you even consider such a thing? But hopefully tonight we'll go through some evidence, mainly biblical evidence, that points in that direction very strongly, I think. So first of all, I think we should contemplate the centrality of the Exodus for all of the Bible and for Christian faith, that it is the foundation of really the gospel, because after creation, it's you are subject to God's law, and if we didn't have the law, we wouldn't even know we fall short. And of course, the gospel is centered on the fact that we as sinners cannot live up to the law, and that the law given at Mount Sinai is what shows us that. It's also been the foundation of Western civilization, Western law. The revelation that became the books of the Bible began at Mount Sinai. How many times in the Bible does God say, remember what I did bringing Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage with a strong arm? And of course, the prophets throughout the Old Testament were calling Israel back, saying, remember the covenant, return to the covenant, repent. And of course, the history of Israel is that they continued to slide until they were finally exiled into Babylon and Assyria and so forth. So really, if the Exodus didn't happen, then the message of the rest of the Bible really can't be true. So it is a very central event, and of course, one of those books Moses wrote about is in Genesis and from the creation onward. So this is really a vital, central issue. But then you might ask, well, yes, but does where these events happen, does that matter at all? I mean, really, is it really the most important thing is that it happened, not how it happened or where it happened? And I would agree that it happened is certainly the most important thing, but I think God spends a lot of time in the Bible revealing to Moses many details on locations and time frames and so forth, so we know they're important to God, and we know that these events are real history that happened in real places, and if you start to get off base on that account, you can start to misunderstand other things as well. And the fact that they might be looking in the wrong place and therefore finding no evidence for the Exodus journey, that feeds into the skepticism and also this attitude that, well, it doesn't really matter where it happened. That kind of leads people, even Christians, to kind of allegorize the story, and that feeds into the skepticism as well. So I think it really is to our benefit to consider these things seriously and to go out and look for real places in real these events in real places. So maybe they haven't found evidence because they are looking in the wrong place. So here's maybe the traditional theory of crossing. I mean, it used to be that people would say they crossed the very north edge of Suez and then came down. But lately, most scholars have gravitated toward thinking that they crossed one of the border lakes of Egypt and then came down the Sinai Peninsula to the traditional site in the southern Sinai Peninsula at the bottom of the screen. And if you look in Bibles, those that are honest will show question marks by every one of these locations because there really is no solid evidence pertaining to any of these sites, and they're mainly just going off tradition. And of course, tradition isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of traditions that are solid and good, but the question is, what is the truth that undergirds that tradition? So the site of Mount Sinai, or Jebel Musa as it's called, Jebel meaning mountain, Musa being Moses, that was really became solidified when Queen Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, designated it. She just basically went down there, and we're told by some monks that that's the place, and so that was the place she chose to be the official site, and she, put her blessing on that. So there wasn't really any evidence or any research done Later, a Greek monastery was built there called St. Catherine's. In the late 60s and 70s, the Israelis gained control of this Sinai Peninsula, and they scoured the whole place looking for any shred of evidence they could, and they found nothing, not at all. So some people started to then question whether it happened, and other people started proposing other mountain sites. And over time, you can see the yellow dots here. Probably at least 24 different sites have been proposed by scholars as what might be the true location of Mount Sinai. You can see that several of them are on the Arabian Peninsula. There's one even on the west side of the Gulf of Suez. So there's a broad range of theories. And among the options that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to focus on a very interesting site in Arabia known as Jabal al-Lawz, which means the Mountain of Almonds. And some people have looked in the Bible and they see that in Galatians chapter 4, Paul actually he mentions Mount Sinai in Arabia. And they say, well, that proves it. Mount Sinai has to be in Arabia. It's not in the Sinai Peninsula. But actually, there's an argument that, well, in Roman times, the Arabian Peninsula, or Arabia, was considered also to include the Sinai Peninsula. So that's not a sure thing that that verse alone is enough to prove it. However, I think a good case can be made that Paul was using Old Testament thinking, and in the Old Testament, every time it talks about Arabia, it's talking about what was today the Arabian Peninsula. But it's not, like I said, a certain thing, so I think that's a good evidence to bring up, but it's not a surefire thing. All the proposals on this map have scholars supporting them that are very confident in their views, and each has some aspect that they like to highlight. And the question is there a good case for any of its mountains, or are they just sort of fragmented ideas that have come about? So as we researched this, we found that there's two general approaches to this problem. We call them the Egyptian view and the Hebrew view. And we kind of caught some flack from that because people they say, well, you're making the Egyptian view sound like the bad guys and the Hebrew view is obviously the good guys. So when you name it that, you're kind of stacking the deck a little bit. But originally it was actually the Near Egypt view and the Far from Egypt view. It became, then I said, well, maybe we need to include something why they think it's near Egypt or far from Egypt. So that became the Egyptian toponym view, and a toponym is another fancy word for a place name. So the Egyptian toponym view likes to focus mainly on the place names in the Bible, the toponyms, and connect them to Egyptian locations and places near Egypt. And while the Hebrew view tends to take a more holistic view of the narrative in the Bible, I would call it the Hebrew narrative view. And so they also consider the toponyms, but they put much more emphasis on the descriptions of what happened and God's miraculous nature and how far they could have gone and so forth. So by a small scale or a large scale exodus, we're talking about things like the size of the Israelite population. The Egyptian view would say it's only 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. The Hebrew view would say no. The text says 600,000 plus men, so it was 2 to 3 million. How much ground could the Israelites cover in a day? The Hebrew view would see that they could cover much more ground. The Egyptian view would not. How deep was the sea that was crossed? The Egyptian view typically has naturalistic explanation for miracles. So they would say, well, it was just a shallow body of water that the wind blowing could displace, and so it was, hip high or something. So they crossed these swamps on the borders of Egypt. And Hebrew view would say, no, the text stresses a deep and mighty sea, so it's got to be a deep and mighty sea. And there's also, hybrid views here. We don't want to pigeonhole all the scholars. There's people who have routes that go far from Egypt and yet include some naturalistic views and so forth. This is Ron Wyatt. He has popularized the idea of Jabal al-Lawz being this mountain in Arabia that we're going to be looking at. It's called Jabal al-Lawz, as I said. And he popularized the view back in the 1980s. And he was over there and with his 2 sons, and he was captured by the Saudis. He was imprisoned, and all of his photos and everything were confiscated. He's a very controversial figure because he has claimed an enormous number of biblical finds that people say, well, no one in 100 years could find all those things. Some people view him as a shyster, and he's just making all this stuff up. Other people think he's led by God and he's, this prophet or something. And so we don't want to base our thinking on the personalities of the people involved. So this is not actually a Ron Wyatt idea. There's scholars back in the 19th century who proposed mountains in Saudi Arabia, today's Saudi Arabia. And so it's not really a Ron Wyatt idea, and we don't want to vilify him, or we don't want to lift him up on a pedestal. We just want to look at the evidence and say, does this mountain match the information that's in the Bible? That's what we want to be our test. So here's another group of we call the Exodus explorers. These are mostly amateurs who have been drawn to this story and have spent their lives looking. Two of them on the side there are Penny and Jim Caldwell. They're one of the earlier visitors to the site. Glenn Fritz in the back is a geographer. Leonard Moeller is a Swedish DNA scientist who has recently passed away. And two others who have visited the mountain back in the early period, in the late 80s, were Larry Williams and Bob Cornuke. You may have heard of them. But they all faced this resistance. Saudi Arabia was kind of closed doors until just a couple years ago as far as researching this site. And so finally the director of the films, Tim Mahoney, who you saw in the trailer, he went there in 2003 with this group, and they were also, everything they had was confiscated, and they were told to leave immediately or they were going to face dire consequences. So it was really a tough place to get into until just recently. There's a shot of the mountain, and after these earlier visitors, they put up fences and so forth. And because of this, the Caldwells really felt that they were trying to hide something. And so they felt more determined than ever that they needed to go back, document what was there, and see what the experts could say about it. And their photos are actually what you see on the World Wide Web. If you ever look up this topic in the last 30 years, any photo that you saw was basically theirs, because they actually lived in Saudi Arabia. Jim worked in the oil industry, and they visited the mountain like 15, 16 times, and they just gathered loads of video and photographs, and they're really the ones who helped to make it popular as well. So you have all these different proposals, and they all have some evidence supporting them, and all the scholars, each of them is very confident in their views, and when you talk to one, when you hear one side of the story, it sounds very convincing. So how do you choose among this myriad of options? And we have what we call the patterns approach, which is you can't cherry pick information. You have to go to the Bible and say, what are the main criteria, the biggest things that are hardest to hide, let's say in the archaeology, or the main features of the geography. Spell those out, and then is there a candidate here that seems to fit every one of those to some degree? Or if it has a major problem, it's probably not the right one. And so naturally this runs up against people who either think they dismiss the Bible as, well, you can't rely on everything in the Bible or whatever, or even conservative Christians who are entrenched in their views. Sometimes they get locked into a certain view, and they like to just ignore things that don't fit their view, and emphasize and sometimes exaggerate those things that do. So I'm going to show a video clip now that covers what the main steps we found for this investigation.
There's no doubt what the Bible means when it says Sinai.
On one hand, it seems reasonable that Mount Sinai should be found in the Sinai Peninsula, since it's named Sinai. But is that reason as strong as it seems?
Well, first of all, you always have to be careful about applying modern names to ancient locations.
Professor Zarnes suggests that the peninsula likely received the name Sinai only after the designation by Queen Helena.
Just because someone slaps on the word Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula doesn't make it so. For example, the Egyptians never referred to it as that. That's a word that's, again, probably classical in orientation.
To do justice to all the candidates and the importance of this issue, I need to investigate all the options more fully. After all, what happened at this mountain was a crucial point in the history of Israel and the world. In my previous films, I had taken a close look at the biblical account to identify a sequence of 6 steps for the Exodus journey. The first 5 steps led them to a sea that was miraculously crossed. Now it's time to investigate the final step of that pattern, destination. It seems that I need to expand this step to show more details for the journey from the sea crossing to the destination of Mount Sinai. The Bible gives important clues about this part of the Exodus, including the journey to the mountain, which went through a series of campsites and wildernesses. The total time from Egypt to the mountain took 45 to 60 days. Mount Sinai was in the vicinity of the land of Midian, where Moses lived with his father-in-law Jethro, and on the back side of the wilderness from Jethro's home. The physical attributes of the mountain should match the appearance and location of Mount Sinai as described in the Bible. And biblical events may have left artifacts from the Israelites' year-long stay at the mountain. I will use these biblical criteria to test 6 of the main locations proposed for Mount Sinai. In this film, I will investigate 3 candidates, and the other 3 in the next film, Journey to Mount Sinai 2.
So the thinking was we'd give the 6 most popular views kind of a chance to make their case, and then hopefully the truth would sort of arise out of that. So I'm going to change the order that you saw there a little bit. I'm going to start with Midian because I think it's so basic, and then I'm going to combine that with the backside of the wilderness, and then I'm going to go into journey, and then attributes, and then artifacts. And you can see some of the biblical references here that have to do, and there's others as well. So people often ignore certain aspects. So when you lay things out like this and kind of grade them, in fact, we came up with a scorecard that we had people fill out that was either a yes, no, or a maybe for each of these steps, in each subpart of these steps. And so when you do that, you can't really hide a weakness. It's going to be exposed. And so the goal would be to have a score for your mountain that, at least to some extent, hits all the major points. And we're not saying that some of the other options are impossible. We're just saying it seems like the biblical information is really pointing in this direction, so why not consider it one of the leading candidates? So the first step is Midian. The Bible says that when Moses fled from Egypt, he stayed in a land called Midian, and he was there for 40 years. And it was during that time that he met with the burning bush at Mount Sinai, and God gave him his commission to go to Egypt. So we know that there's some connection between Midian and the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. And this also shows that at the bush, God told him to bring the Israelites back to that mountain. So the initial destination in the Exodus was not the promised land. A lot of people put mountains up far to the north because they say, well, they're on their way to the promised land. But initially, they weren't on the way to the promised land. They first had to go to Mount Sinai. And then, after they made the covenant with God, then they could move forward to the promised land. So some of the rationale for people putting mountains far to the north really doesn't hold up when you just do a straight reading of what the account says. So the obvious implication is that Mount Sinai should be in or near, or very near, you would think, the land of Midian. And most maps put Midian on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, and we'll see a map here in a second. So this raises the question to some of these mountain candidates, how come you're so far away from Midian? Some point to the fact that Midianites were traders, and you see them in the Bible in all sorts of places, so they say, well, Mount Sinai could be anywhere. Or they say, well, maybe Midian extended all the way over into the Sinai Peninsula, but we'll see later why that's unlikely, and that the Bible does say he stayed in the land of Midian. So this was the central part where Midianites were from. And so the question is, where exactly was Midian? So on this map, we have where Midian has traditionally been placed. And you see the 6 mountain candidates here. You see 2 in the Sinai Peninsula that we chose, especially the traditional Mount Sinai in the south. And then 2 up in the northern part of the Sinai. And then Jebel al-Lawz is right where the word Midian is, right at the core of Midian. And then even further to the south is a mountain called Mount Better, or Halal Better. That's actually volcanic, and we'll get into that later as well. So where is Midian? Modern road signs say Midian, right where we have the word Midian here. Medieval maps put Midian here. The Arab geographers from the 800s, 900s, said Midian was here. You go back to Josephus, Eusebius, St. Jerome, they all put Midian in this area. In fact, they mention a place called Madian, which is a city called Madian, near the coast of the Red Sea. And so there are no remains of any kind of city on the Sinai Peninsula. It's really been a backwater throughout all of history. So the only place we know there's cities is in this better watered area of Midian, which is in the southern area, pretty much where the name Midian is there on the map. You go further north, it gets drier. So we have many towns down there. We have records of lush forests, palm forests, and we have lots of animals. The Greeks talk about animals living there, foxes and wolves and cattle and so forth. So there's even an archaeological site called Karaya that's just up to the northeast of that, where they made something called Midianite pottery, and that's spread all over the Arabian region. There's none of that in the Sinai Peninsula. So all these indicators, and one thing that they've just recently found in the last couple of years, there's a inscription from Ramses III when he went into this area, and he left his marker there, and it mentioned Midian. So that's a pretty good indication. So all the way back as far as we can go, everything is agreeing that this is Midian. And then you go to the Bible, and it says, well, who was Midian? Midian was Abraham's son through Keturah, his wife he married after Sarah died. And he sent all of his sons, who were not Isaac, he sent them all to the east, away from Isaac. He sent them out of the promised land eastward to the east country, it says. So this also lines up with the fact that Midian is east. So you can ignore this Yam Suf reference for now, but I'm just showing where the promised land is in green. And if Abraham sent Midian east of the promised land, he has to be east. He cannot be the Sinai Peninsula. That would be west of the promised land. And so you have the Bible agreeing with all the secular sources that Midian was east. We know Edom. We know Moab was just across from the Dead Sea, and then below that was Edom. In fact, the top of the Gulf of Aqaba there. And I don't know if you can see that clearly, but this is the Gulf of Aqaba here. So the two options are the Gulf of Suez for a sea crossing, or the Gulf of Aqaba. We know that up here is Moab. We know Edom is over in here. And we know even at the top end of the Gulf, there's a place there where Solomon had his ships, and they call that Edom. So naturally Midian would be then further down from that. So everything agrees. It's like saying Florida's east of Minnesota. Well, it's not directly east, but it is east of Minnesota. We can't be sure exactly how extensive Midian was. We don't know its boundaries, but we have a good idea where it was at. So Exodus 3:1 says, from his home in Midian, he was staying with Jethro, Moses took Jethro's sheep up to the backside of the wilderness. And some people say, oh, he went to the backside of the wilderness, and sometimes backside, the biblical term there, can mean westward. So he went west to the Sinai Peninsula, they'll say. So the question is, how far might have Moses has traveled? And there's different views on interpreting that term, but the basic biblical meaning is far side or backside. And most translations have that, although some do have west side. Most of the Hebrew scholars we interviewed agreed that the basic meaning is backside. It doesn't have to mean west. There's no reason to mandate anything that was west. And when you look at Midian, there's high elevation. There's a range of mountains there that have very good high pasture lands that in the summer stay cooler and have lots of foliage for the sheep. There's plenty of places to graze sheep in Midian. There's no reason for Moses to go trekking way up over the top of the Gulf of Aqaba over into the Sinai Peninsula. It's over 200 miles one way. And that's through the drier area, and it's through areas contested by different tribes. Every tribe has their own little area that they're in control of, so it really makes no sense. And he'd also be traveling directly back into the area that the Egyptians controlled. They had mines in that peninsula, so there's no reason for him to be going there. Some have argued that there's a verse that says Jethro and Hobab in another place had to return to his own land. And they said, oh, that means when he was at Mount Sinai, he met with Moses at Mount Sinai. And so it says there, after he was done meeting with Moses, he said, oh, I have to return to my own land. And they say, oh, that means he had to return to Midian. So that means he wasn't in Midian. But It doesn't say he had to return to Midian, he had to return to his land, and that word aretz just means land, and it's used elsewhere in the Torah. It's used for someone's, like their farm, their plot of land. So there's no reason to think that the mountain was outside Midian. It might have been just outside Midian, but there's no reason to demand that. So if we look at Midian, just looking at the 6 primary candidates, Jebel al-Lawz would be, that gets an A+, and the further you get from Midian, the more explaining you need to have to say why that is. And the worst candidates are actually the traditional mountain and the other one in the western part of the Sinai Peninsula there. So that would be the first step of the pattern. So the next step is the journey to the mountain. The journey to the mountain includes a series of campsites. In Numbers chapter 33, God commands Moses to record the campsites of the journey. And so we have that complete list of campsites there. The Bible mentions several wildernesses that they encountered on the way. And there's also a few key chronological markers along the way as well. One aspect of the journey that you can start with is that, Mount Sinai should be on the far side of the Red Sea. And the Hebrew term for Red Sea is Yam Suf. Yam means sea. Suf is disputed. Some people think it means reeds, others have other definitions. But the key is that the Bible gives 7 distinct verses where it locates this Yam Suf, or the Red Sea, that the Israelites crossed in the Gulf of Aqaba and nowhere else. And there are no verses that indicate it being in Suez or anywhere else. So that alone should say, that's got to be a leading candidate. And in our previous film, in the Red Sea Miracle films, we covered that quite extensively, the arguments for why the Gulf of Aqaba is a prime suspect for which sea was crossed. And it certainly is a deep and mighty sea, and it would require a great miracle to cross, which is probably why a lot of people are not too happy about it. But if that's what the Bible is saying, I'd say the deeper, the better, So the Egyptian approach has the sea crossing near Egypt. The Hebrew approach has the Gulf of Aqaba. So naturally, if Aqaba was the sea that was crossed, then Mount Sinai would be beyond, in Midian, which makes sense. And just as a side note, even if let's say the Gulf of Suez was actually what they crossed, a mountain in Midian, in Arabia, would still be viable. You could cross Suez and still go to a Mount Sinai over there as well. So this is the list of 11 campsites that Moses lists in Numbers 33 between Egypt and Mount Sinai. And there was 3 before the sea crossing. That little blue symbol there is the parted sea. So you can see at the bottom of this timeline is weeks, and then each vertical line is a day. So there were 3 campsites before the crossing, and Mount Sinai was camp 11. So there's no known evidence of the journey of the Israelites at any of these campsites. There's no remains from a group, but that's to be expected because nomadic groups, when they're traveling, they don't carry heavy things with them like pots. They're not building brick structures that are going to survive for centuries to be found later. They're carrying their water in leather pouches, of course. They have tents that are going to rot if anything is left behind. One exception might be Mount Sinai, where they did spend a year, and there's lots of activity that happened there that might have left some signs. So other than that, we're looking for places that make sense geographically. And make a note of Camp 7 there, that wilderness of sin. That's raised up a little bit because that's one of the key markers chronologically. As they left on the 15th day of the first month, they hit the wilderness of sin 15th day of the second month. So we know it was exactly 1 month between the departure point and Camp 7, wilderness of sin. And then Mount Sinai is not 100% clear how long it took. Somewhere between, as they said, 45 to 60 days. This key issue is something we're going to look at in the next film clip we have here about this journey step.
Those in the Hebrew approach, including Exodus explorer Ryan Morrow, have another challenge for the traditional Sinai location, based on the Israelites' travel speed to Mount Sinai.
The traditional Mount Sinai candidate makes sense if you believe the Israelites only had to travel a few miles per day, but that doesn't seem to be what the Bible really describes. What you see is a situation where they were going as fast as they possibly could, more than just a few miles a day. They were traveling day and night. That's the whole point behind having a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, so that they could continuously travel. The Bible seems to make it sound like it's a miracle, how they didn't stumble and how they're able to just keep going that long distance. The traditional Mount Sinai doesn't seem to fit that description.
I need to look more closely at this important aspect.
Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt on the 15th day of the first month on the Hebrew calendar. On the 15th day of the second month, they entered the wilderness of Sin. And in the third month, on that day, the Israelites arrived in the wilderness of Sinai, their destination.
There are different opinions about how long it took the Israelites to reach Mount Sinai, based on Exodus 19, verse 1. The different options derived from this passage result in a total travel time ranging somewhere between 45 and 60 days from the departure point in Goshen. Plugging in the timing and distances for David's route to the mountain results in an average travel speed of only about 5.5 miles a day. The Bible talks about the fact that it wasn't until the third month that the Israelites reached Mount Sinai. So would that have been around a 2-month trip from leaving this area in Goshen all the way down to this location?
I think that's about right. Bearing in mind they're stopping at various places for resting. So where there's copious water supply, they will rest up for quite a period of time. Elim probably 3 weeks. So I think it's perfectly acceptable that from here down to here, 2 months would do it about right.
Okay. David believes the Israelites could travel up to 20 miles a day, which was the average travel speed for a caravan in the ancient world. This requires him to propose a 2 to 3 week stay at one of the camps to fill out the time. But does a 3-week stay fit the Bible's description of traveling day and night?
The biblical description doesn't seem to match the idea that the Israelites would stay in one spot for weeks at a time. This wasn't a casual stroll. This was a dramatic escape.
When the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, God said,
You yourself have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.
Eagle's wings is a common biblical theme that the prophet Isaiah helps us better understand.
But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint.
So some scholars say, well, these were daily stations. 11 camps would be 11 days, but we know it was 45 to 60 days to reach Mount Sinai. So you can see right there, these are not daily stations. A straight average, if you just take 11 camps for 45 days, would be about 2.5 days, perhaps 2.5 days of travel, followed maybe by 2 days in camp. So 4.5 days of travel and camping per site. And again, the further you get from that average, you have to say, well, what's your explanation then? And that would fit traveling day and night, and you have a huge group of people, so once they get going, you're not going to want to stop them. It takes probably forever to get everybody going, and once you get moving, you don't want to stop. So that makes sense for traveling day and night, and that makes sense also that why these camps are so significant. They probably stayed there for a couple days to rest up after an extended period where they might have been resting or even sleeping a little bit during that stretch, but it was pretty much, they didn't set up camp for several days in a row probably. Every aspect, the Bible points to haste. They left in haste, before the bread even rose. They traveled day and night behind the pillar while they were going. And when they got brought to Sinai, God said, I brought you out on eagle's wings. Some people say, well, they were going slow because they had to graze the sheep. And we know that sheep being taken to market, they can go great distances. People say they were slow because they were sick. And, the Bible says none stumbled, not even their feet swelled. They say this verse about eagle's wings. Well, it's not, the term there is not really eagles, it's really vultures. And it's probably that includes eagles and vultures. Maybe they're the same kind of bird, but it doesn't really matter if they're vultures or eagles because there's 17 other passages in the Torah that speak about the actions of eagles. And 2 of those are about vultures or eagles picking at dead things. So that's obviously not what it's talking about here. So the other 15 verses, though, every one emphasizes the eagle's speed, its strength, its covering great distances, and swiftness is explicitly mentioned in 15, or in I think 11 of those 15 passages. And here's one in Jeremiah. You know, behold, he comes like the clouds, his chariots like the whirlwind, his horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are ruined. And so, I mean, that's probably even referencing back to the Exodus, where God said, I brought you out on eagle's wings. So, staying in one place for 3 weeks at a time because the water was good and they felt like resting. Or one proposal is they stayed a month in one spot because the men were circumcised and they had to recover. And, you know, that's a very, you know, clever idea, but I mean, I don't know why you'd need a month to recover, even if that was the case. And there's nothing in the Bible that that demands that interpretation. So as a general description, I think those views that emphasize slow travel, that really just contradicts the Bible's report. And perhaps more importantly, it downplays the miraculous power of God in bringing them out. The amazing supernatural things he did with providing for them water and manna and clothes not wearing out and so forth. So as mentioned, the average travel rate for a caravan was 20 miles a day. Armies would go a little slower because they were heavily laden with equipment and so forth. So there's no reason why the Israelites would move just a few miles a day. In fact, the Israelite camp was probably several miles long. So if they just moved 4 or 5 miles a day, they would be, people at the back of the camp would be moving to the other end of the camp. And the Mayo Clinic actually did a study that hunter-gatherers and farmers in the ancient world, they walked about 16 to 17,000 steps a day, whereas today the average is only 3,000 or 4,000 steps. So that's the difference between walking 8 miles and about 2 miles. So people were just in their daily activities were used to walking 8 miles a day. And think of the slaves. They were used to working 7 days a week, and they were, I'm sure, very tough and hardy. And the Bible actually gives the report of Jacob fleeing from Laban when he came out of Haran and came down to the hills of Gilead. That equates, when you read that account carefully, in 10 days they covered over 350 miles. And he had thousands of animals with him. He gave Esau, hundreds and hundreds of animals. He had it talks about shepherds with him. So he had his children, he had his wives. Yes, they were on camels, but the slowest factor would be the animals and herding the animals. And if they could cover 35 miles a day at great need, there's no reason to say the Israelites were limited to 4 or 5 miles a day. So here's one of the 6 mountains that's closest is called Jebel Sinai. One of the reasons they picked this mountain is Sinai is linguistically very similar to Sinai. It's only 210 miles. And for this one, it's only 3.5 miles a day average. And that's based on 60 days. And I think the better case is for 50 days, because there's a very strong tradition that the law was given at Mount Sinai on the 50th day on Pentecost. And then that links up to then in the New Testament that through the mouth of Peter, the new law of Christ given on Pentecost to the apostles and the believers at that time. So there's a couple other factors that I think that favor the 50 days to Passover. And we know they were at Mount Sinai at least 3 days before they received the law. So that's probably 45 to 47 days travel would be the better figure. And that would bring it down to less than 3 miles a day average. Other near Egypt mountains are a little bit better, but not much. Any one could be reached in a couple of weeks' time, so at most 3 weeks. 20 days rather than 45 days. This is the mountain that's furthest away is Mount Bedr or Halal Bedr in Arabia. The reason that was picked was because it's a volcano, and we'll get to that in a little bit here, but even that is only averaging 10 miles a day overall, which means they're going maybe 15 to 20 miles a day on the days they're traveling. And as we'll see, Jebel al-Lawz is actually about the same because you cannot go straight from the ocean to Jebel al-Lawz. So this fits the biblical requirement best. It's better, much better than the ones that are near Egypt. One proportion challenge that is given is they say, hey, Jebel al-Lawz cannot be the mountain because the Bible has 3 campsites before the crossing. It's got 8 afterwards. So you got to have more travel after the crossing than before. And Jebel al-Lawz is only 35 miles away from the Gulf of Aqaba, so therefore you got to rule that out. But in reality, they don't maybe recognize that there's a huge range of mountains running north to south. You cannot go through them with masses of people. And you either have to go way to the south through a pass or way up to the north. Plus you're gaining elevations and you're restricted in these narrow valleys, so you can't travel with 100 people wide. So it's going to really slow you down. And so it totally makes sense why it would take that long to get to Jebel al-Lawz. That I just showed you, that would be Glenn Fritz's route. He's the geographer in the film. This is Steve Rudd's route. He has them crossing the Straits of Tiran down in the south end of Aqaba. There's really 2 deep water passages through Aqaba that have been proposed. This is the Caldwell route. So there's different ideas about exactly where they went, but they all fit generally the Bible's time frames. And they answer the proportion challenge. They have the best overall travel rates. They're on the far side of Yam Suf, and they're in the land of Midian, so it just seems to everything to fit much better. It's when you plug in the details from the biblical account and really map it out that you really start to see what might be the better claim. So when we look at the campsites to the traditional mountain, one of their main arguments is that, well, you got all these toponyms or place names, these Arabic place names mostly. Bir Marat, that's the well of Marat, that's equal to Mara, and you go down the list, there's some connections between these sites. Of course, getting to Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa, they say. But the question is, are all these traditional names just put there because of the tradition, and they just go backwards and say, oh, this would be a good site for Mara. Here's a palm tree. This must be Elim, and so forth. And you got to guard against that for every one of the proposals. Does it fit the big picture? So we know in the Byzantine period, and even the Coptic Christians in Egypt, they're really big on relics. They're really big on identifying sites that they call, this is where Jesus did this miracle. That they invent even miracles that aren't even in the Bible. So they're really big on getting their church or their site on the pilgrim route, so people will visit their site. So that's something that's very common in that area. And again, some traditions may be good, but you have to be questioning what's the truth that undergirds them. Another proposal for the journey is the one to Har Karkum, which is in the white there. Deb Hearn has proposed watersheds define the wildernesses, and if we can do that, then we can figure out the way. And it's actually a very helpful idea. But not all wildernesses are defined this way. We know, for example, the wilderness of Judah is on both sides of the mountain. Some go down to the Dead Sea, some would go to the Mediterranean. And certain things of this proposal don't add up. For instance, she has no campsite in the wilderness of Sin, but the Bible says they camped in the wilderness of Sin, and a couple other oddities like that. So she also puts a big emphasis on being on roads and wells that are 10 to 20 miles apart. But the question is, could a couple wells really sustain the Israelites? If there were just a couple thousand, maybe, but a couple million, you've seen what's happened in Death Valley this year with the rains, a couple inches of rain, and they have a 12-mile long lake in Death Valley, one of the driest, hottest places on earth. And the Bible says God made it rain. So I think that's probably the primary way they got water. And at times they didn't have water, of course, and God had to miraculously step in. But so one of the wildernesses that is a challenge is the wilderness of Shur. The issue is that Shur was the wilderness they entered immediately after the crossing, and therefore Shur has to be where the crossing happened. And if Shur is right next to Egypt, it means the crossing was right next to Egypt. They go together. And every Bible map you pick up is probably going to put Shur right next to those little border lakes of Egypt. They base it on this verse, their main support. First of all, I think the main reason they put it there is they think the crossing happened there, so that's where they put Shur. But here's one place they do offer some support, and this verse that says, the sons of Ishmael, they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. So they say this term here, opposite Egypt, or on the face of Egypt, or east of Egypt. They say that means adjacent to Egypt. It has to be right next to Egypt. But you look in other places in the Bible, and this same term, opposite, sometimes means adjacent to, but other times it doesn't. For example, it says up in the north, in the valley where Jericho is, It says that Jericho is opposite Mount Nebo, and those two positions are 50 miles apart. So in the context of the borders of Canaan and the valley of Jericho, 50 miles is thought to be on the face of or in front of, And this is a huge context. This is Egypt to Assyria, which is like 1,000 miles away almost. So it doesn't violate being opposite Egypt for sure to be far from Egypt. And if you look at the front half of that verse, the sons of Ishmael were settled from Havilah to Shur. We know that, where does the Bible say Abraham sent his sons, Midian and Ishmael and the others? East of the promised land. So if they lived from Havilah to Shur, that would suggest Shur must be east of the promised land as well, not 150 miles to the west over by Egypt. So this is not a challenge. In fact, I think the Bible favors Shur being over by Midian. So this is Humphrey's route to Mount Better. It's 210 air miles from the top of Aqaba there down through to his site. And it fits some things really great. I mean, in the north there's not much water. That fits the Israelites traveling in Shur for 3 days and not finding water. However, when you look back, there's no great detour off the main route where, like Pharaoh said, they're lost in the wilderness. The wilderness has shut them in. They kind of stay on the main route the whole way. He has a shallow water crossing, which I don't think fits the Bible. And as we'll see in a bit, it doesn't fit, I think, one of the key issues, which is the 11 days to Kadesh Barnea. And we'll look at that in a minute. So his main motivation is getting to a volcano, and I don't think that's needed at all. So we don't know, again, where exactly all these sites are, but there are sites that fit well, such as this is an Elam site along those routes. The Bible says there was 12 wells and 70 palms, and people who have visited this site claim there are 12 wells there. Not sure that this is it, but it fits. Along the Caldwell's route, they come up, their Rephidim site is at this split rock, and this thing is like 4 stories high. Split right down the middle. That's where in Psalm it said he split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundantly from the deep. They found other things around this rock. We know they battled the Amalekites there, and where they find sling stones all over the place here. They find hut circles or things that we think held down tents, numerous ones, and so forth. So another aspect of the journey that fits this area well is the second camp on Yam Suf. We know after they crossed, they went to Elam or Marah, then Elam, and then Camp 6 was Yam Suf again. And if you cross the border lakes up next to Egypt, then you have to say, as they come down the Sinai Peninsula, the Gulf of Suez is Yam Suf. And so they'll say, and yet we know the Bible calls Aqaba Yam Suf. So they'll say, well, yeah, Aqaba's Yam Suf, Suez is Yam Suf, and the border lakes are Yam Suf. Everything's Yam Suf. And it's like, well, okay, but I haven't seen any evidence yet that anybody called those border lakes Yam Suf. So we move on to the next step, attributes of the mountain. Here are some biblical references. Some of the major ones being you need a plain large enough to house all the Israelites. You need enough water to sustain them for a year. You need a stream. The Bible says there was a stream coming down from the mountain. There was a cave that Elijah visited where he heard God's still small voice. That was at the mountain of God. So these are some basic things that you need to have. And that's the subject of this next clip. This one's going to be focusing on the traditional Mount Sinai.
The next step in the traditional mountain investigation is the attributes of the mountain. It has several aspects for Mount Sinai derived from the Bible, including the fact that the mountain needed a plain large enough for the Israelite campsite, and it would need enough water to sustain the people and their flocks and herds for nearly a year-long stay. It had a stream flowing from the mountain, and it had a cave where later in the Bible the prophet Elijah would stay. So how does the traditional Sinai measure up to these criteria?
How are you going to prove it? How are we going to prove it? Well, you're not going to find parts of the Ten Commandments on any of these mountains. I do know that in front of what is traditionally Mount Sinai, there's a large plain called the Plain of Raha, which we have wonderful drawings by Roberts in the 1850s, where you could have thousands of people standing there. I know of no other place in Sinai that can replicate that the two conditions, tall mountain and a plain in front of it. In Midian, I don't know the answer.
Well, I've heard suggestions that there just isn't enough room for an encampment at the traditional Mount Sinai.
Absolutely not true. This is a massive plain they call the Araha Plain. It's huge. St. Catherine's Monastery is just here. And this is a very, very broad sandy plain where a massive camp could be set up, a huge camp.
When the children of Israel left Egypt, there were 600,000 men of military age, plus their families. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and great numbers of livestock, flocks, and herds.
The Egyptian approach doesn't believe the Bible was meaning 600,000 men, but rather 600 groups. So I need to visualize the Israelite population along with the camping areas available at all the proposed mountains. If each Israelite family of 10 is assigned a 40 by 40 foot space, then a group of 1,000 would occupy a square about the size of 3 football fields. The Egyptian approach typically estimates the Israelite population at between 5 and 30,000. The space available at the traditional mountain could easily have accommodated this number. However, the Hebrew approach believes that there were at least 2 to 3 million Israelites. If that were the case, they would not have had the room to camp there.
Moses commanded the Israelites to wash their clothes in preparation to meeting God.
So that tall mountain he talked about, as Josephus and Philo talked about Mount Sinai being the tallest mountain in the region. So the only mountain that fits that is Jebel Allah out of all these, and some of them are really short. They're like between 500 feet and 1,000 feet. So they're basically big hills or ridges. They're not even really mountains. And if you think about the population, some people have scoffed at that and said, well, if there was 10 people wide, that would be a line of people 150 miles long. And that's true, but what if there was 100 people wide? Then it would be 15 miles wide. What if there was 200 people wide? Well, now it's 7.5 miles wide. So there's no reason to doubt that the size of the group. And the next attribute I'm going to show actually another clip now, I think is the key qualifier for where Mount Sinai is, and that's the distance to Kadesh Barnea, which was reached after they left Mount Sinai.
This camp called Kadesh Barnea was the base from which Moses sent out the 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. Several sites have been proposed for Kadesh Barnea, but all are somewhat near each other. Moses appears to record the specific distance from Mount Sinai, or Horeb, to Kadesh Barnea.
It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea.
Biblical geographer Barry Beitzel did an extensive study of travel days in ancient times, finding that the term travel day was simply the way to communicate a standard distance that equaled about 20 miles. This would be like someone today saying a destination is an hour drive away. On a highway, this would translate to a distance of about 60 miles. Plotting an arc 11 travel days south from the proposed Kadesh Barnea sites and using this 20 miles a day standard creates zones that pass near 3 of the main Mount Sinai candidates, with the others being much too near or else too far. Advocates of the other mountains have various explanations to solve this problem, but it seems like a difficult obstacle to overcome. If the Exodus Sea crossing was at Aqaba, it would leave only one candidate, Jebel Alaz. This mountain was first made prominent in the 1980s by Ron Wyatt and his 2 sons. Because Wyatt was such a big part of the history of this location, I traveled to Tennessee to see Mary Nell Wyatt Lee, Ron's widow.
Okay, so we know, the key here is that we know the Israelites did not take 11 days to reach Kadesh Barnea. We know that from the book of Numbers. For example, Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days with leprosy and so forth, and you add up all the events, and it was much longer than 11 days that the Israelites took. So we know this is a standard distance Moses is talking about in Deuteronomy when he's saying, hey guys, it's only 11 days from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. It's taken you 40 years to make it because of your rebellion, your constant rebellion. And so it was a point being made about how far away they were, and the fact that what should have taken them 11 days took them 40 years. So if we look at the attributes, the traditional Mount Sinai, as we saw, doesn't have a campsite that's big enough. The others do. Some consider themselves holy mountains. I don't know that the Bible stipulates that it was considered a holy mountain afterward or before. Only Lawes and Mount Better seem to have substantial caves. And of course, it's the highest mountain in the area. Some put it on a junction of two roads, and they say this road, the northern road, is the Mount Sierra road that the Bible says they took, but we don't really know that that's the Mount Sierra road. They kind of just name it that because it's by their mountain. There's nothing that says there was a road that went right to Mount Sinai. We know they took a road at some point after they left, but we don't know that it was right at Mount Sinai. Colin Humphreys proposes that Mount Sinai was a volcano. He says, well, you got smoke, you got lightning, you got shaking, you got this burning bush he thinks is a volcanic vent that turned this bush to flame and made charcoal out of it. And there's no volcanoes on the Sinai Peninsula. And his approach is he wants to see miracles first to see if there's a scientific explanation for them. But I think we need to first start with the Bible and see if it's describing this as something that goes beyond what you'd expect to normally happen. And we know that God's presence is described in this way of smoking and fire and shaking and so forth in many places where it has nothing to do with a volcano. So there's nothing, this is, the description of Mount Sinai is very consistent with how God is normally talked about. This is the glory of God. In the pillar of cloud and fire, it went with them. So we know that Mount Sinai was not a volcano because the same fire that was on the mountain then led them. Attributes at Jebel al-Lawz, and I want to make one note here that the peak of Jebel al-Lawz is actually the highest point, but it's a shoulder of the mountain a few miles away. That's Jebel Makla. That's where those explorers are actually finding all this evidence, about 4 miles apart. So I got a clip here of what that looks like when we go to that site.
Was there enough water in this area to sustain the Israelites?
There was a very high demand of water. We had the cattle, we had all the people, and further it is said that it should wash their clothes.
The Caldwells experienced more precipitation at this location due to its elevation.
You can imagine it is now solid ice pellets.
Falling,
See the ice building up on the
like down here on the dash.
on the dash. Yeah.
There is also lots of vegetation.
Get up in there and look at these things.
Whoa, look how big!
But what about evidence of a stream coming down from the mountain at this location?
Still today we can see a kind of waterfall pouring down in a great canyon from the mountain. And we can see on each step of this dried waterfall ponds of water, even in the middle of summer with very high temperatures.
I didn't see anything like this at any of the other mountain candidates. There are multiple seasonal streams, and there's evidence that some of these are not just temporary.
Here we can find living animals that require year-round access to water, like frogs. Also a lot of plants that need constant access to water.
The next attribute is a cave that fits the account of the prophet Elijah coming to Mount Sinai. High above the plain on the side of the mountain, the Caldwells could see what looked to be a cave. After several failed attempts, Jim finally reached the site.
I've climbed up to 5740 in elevation, and it looks like to be like a shallow cave up here. And I can't tell if it's chiseled out or natural. It's a substantial cave. It's dark in the back. Quite an overhang. Sticks out about 20 feet. Get an idea what it looks like from the opening of the cave.
The Exodus explorers believe this cave seems to fit the Bible's description, which implies a cave of some size that Elijah lodged in and was told to stand at its entrance. Besides these main attributes, the explorers believe there are more that fit the biblical descriptions. In the last few years, Saudi Arabia has become more open to tourism, allowing greater access to these sites.
Commentators say it seems as though the mountain is structured in a two-tiered fashion, because the Lord calls Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu and the 70 elders up the mountain, but then he tells Moses to come all the way up. Sort of like the temple itself, where you have the holy place, but then you also have the Holy of Holies. And so when you're standing at the base of the mountain looking up at Elijah's cave, you just see the first peak, but once you get up over that peak, there's a plateau up there. It's roughly the size of a football field, and it's flat. I mean, you could land 10 helicopters up there.
The Caldwells often camped in this place because it was just out of sight from the plain below.
That's the direction we came from, so I guess that's looking due west.
And when I got up there, I looked and I said, this is obviously, clearly where Moses and the elders ate the meal, the marriage sealing, covenant sealing meal. And they looked up, and the scriptures say they saw God and they ate and drank. The very structure of the mountain itself aligns with what the biblical narrative says.
While it fits the account well, I should note that there's no direct evidence that this is the place.
I should also note there's these blue stones around there. And the Caldwells comment, and you can see it on some of the video, it's so blue. And in that account of God meeting with the elders, it says, they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And so that's an interesting possible connection there. So now we move on to artifacts, and I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to note a few things here. That there's an altar that was said to be put up at the mountain with 12 pillars. There was a large encampment, and then of course the golden calf incident where they worshiped the golden calf. And there's lots of things that mention inscriptions, not necessarily that they were inscribing on the rocks, but there was inscribing going on. At Jebel Sinai, there's these, by the mines, they have these inscriptions that they claim are talking about manna and warning against golden calf worship. And the problem is that everyone disagrees. Everyone has their own interpretation of these. They're all different. These are very hard to read, and so they're great, probably early Hebrew writings. But even if they are talking about manna, the Israelites could have visited this site anytime during the 40 years, and so any of the mountains could have, sent contingents to this mines because they were a great place to pick up materials. So it doesn't prove the case especially when there's so many other things that are against it. At Har Karkum, they do have a set of 12 pillars, which are very interesting. They also have a lot of other artifacts, but they've been dated many centuries before the Exodus. I don't know how much you can rely on the dating, but Deb Hearn, the proponent of this, even doesn't think that these most of the artifacts there pertain to the Exodus. So there's these giant seep wells there that are like 17 feet across. There are two lines of stones with gravel in between, and there seems to be a depression where there's a lake at the base of Jebel Makla. And these seep wells ring the lake, and they found 3 or 4, and there seems to be remains of others, and they've dug them down, and it would be a perfect way to harvest water. There's other places in the Middle East where they do this, where they dig down until they reach the water table and the water comes up, but at a lake it would be very plentiful, and these stones would keep the animals from muddying the water and so forth. And the fact is, this is a very remote area. It's not on any of the trade routes. It's a backwater, and yet you have these giant water holding reservoirs that are hard to explain. Some people think this is the altar where there's 12 pillars in front. Now these pillars, you can see the white things clearly are, but yeah, you see those like sections of pillar round. That they appear to be maybe a little bit older, later, more recent. So, but the altar itself would be at the end of these corridors. There's a section where there's a very deep layer of ash, and this thing is 120 feet long. It's very odd, and so it does fit actually the construction of sheep kraals, because when you're slaughtering animals, if they can't see what's happening at the other end, then they can move forward and you can herd groups of sheep through that. We actually talked to a sheep expert and said, wow, 8-foot wide corridors, 120 feet long, that's perfect. She said, I've designed things like that. The pillars are more of a mystery. If they're more recent, maybe it was a memorial that was put up at the site in a later period. We just don't know. There is bull inscriptions there with people, this guy underneath the bull you can see with raised hands. That's like a sign of worship. We don't know if the Israelites made these, or if, at the very least, I think they would encourage the Israelites to worship the bull, the golden calf. A lot of people say these date older than that, but again, I don't know how much you can trust the dates. There's a huge cemetery the size of 21 football fields, and it's filled with these standing stone markers, these monoliths. And it's really, again, hard to explain. There's no sign of a city in the area other than, the remains here. But the account is after the golden calf incident, God killed 3,000, or he told the Levites to get their swords and slay the people who were worshiping the golden calf, and 3,000 people were said to die that day. And then God sent a plague and killed even more. So again, this would be several miles outside the camp, but if the camp was several miles long, it would actually be just outside the camp. We know they would bury their dead just outside the camp. That fits as well. There's other things like sandal print inscriptions. There's even a find I've seen recently where they found little kilns and furnaces, and they found a rock that's seems to have been shaped just how you would if you were beating out gold on it in the shape of angels' wings. And it's like, wow, that's amazing. And there's obviously a lot of more research that needs to be done at this spot. And it's actually under threat because the Saudis are building this huge city of Neom. It's like $500 billion to $1 trillion. They're having this like 80-mile long city that's really, they call it the line. It's just a bizarre futuristic thing they're building, but they're gonna have a ski resort not too far away from this spot. It's just crazy all the things they're doing over there. But we can't be 100% sure that this is the site, but I think every sign is pointing to this is the place where it might have happened. And if it is, if more research is done and more comes to light, I think it could be just a great testimony to the truth of God's word. And I think it just causes us to pause and imagine that scene at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and that would just draw us to worship him even more. So with that, this is our website that you can go to you can sign up for free Thinker updates. We have an online store, more information. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time coming up here for Q&A. I know there's a couple announcements, and we are selling some materials here. We also have curriculum for like homeschoolers. We have a few books, but mainly our main bread and butter is these feature-length films we've created. So with that, I will turn it over to are you doing the announcements? Or?
All right.
Oh, great.
All right. Let's give him a hand.
Let me turn this off.
Isn't that great? That was great.
So I saw an archaeological film talking about Goshen in Egypt, and how the archaeologists couldn't find any evidence of the Israelites living there for 400 years. Until they realized where the real Goshen was, and it was like further to the east and closer to the Mediterranean or something. Is the Goshen that was mentioned here, are you familiar with those two Goshen locations, and are they far enough apart that they would off a number of days?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with what film that may, or what proposal that may, but I think everyone's pretty settled where Goshen was generally. It's the Nile Delta area. So they might be talking about two different areas in the Delta that are several miles apart or something. So our first film does cover that issue, and it covers the Israelites in Egypt and then later arriving in Canaan. So, but I'm not familiar with what that might be. Anybody else? In the back, yes.
How do you think that do you think the climate, for one, was different at the time of the Exodus as it is now, and how would that affect the Exodus?
So the question is, how does the climate change affect things? Because we know that in the past it was a little bit wetter. For example, the Bible talks about the forests of Arabia. We know that in the Negev there was agriculture going on back then that is not possible today. So all indications are that it was a little wetter back then, maybe not dramatically wetter, But I think it would be more like a savanna, more like a grassland, where today it would be desert. And so there were certainly dry areas. We know the Bible talks about at times they ran into stretches where there was no water. But I think it generally was better than today, and I think that would help with the proposals that have the Israelites going further distances through the landscape, that they could handle that because the sheep would have foliage to eat as they went and so forth. So I don't think it was nearly as hostile as it is today. So I think that would do nothing but make this further proposal more feasible. Yes?
Is the Saudi Arabian government a little more open to like tourism? Are there tour groups that can go in there?
Yeah, so the question is about the Saudi Arabia government. They have opened up a lot more in the last couple of years. Before that, it was really people had to sneak in there without permission. They got arrested. These frontier forces are really what was going on. I mean, you have the official government, and then you have these guys that are kind of doing their own thing, and they don't have complete control of them. So you're not sure exactly where things are emanating from. But yes, in the last couple of years, they've even started tour groups that go there. So you can sign up for a tour, and we don't know if it's going to stay that way, forever. But at least right now, the climate is much better for tourism there, and you can go visit Jebel al-Lawz next, this coming year if you so choose. Anyone else? Yes.
What is the significance of Sinai to Muslim tradition, and how does that relate or not relate to Christian tradition?
Well, the locals in the area call it Jebel Musa. They call it the Mountain of Moses. And so they, it's a little hard because I know the Muslims believe that the Bible is not reliable. It's been altered, they believe, and they think the Quran is the only true, testimony. So I'm not sure exactly what they would, think about this, but certainly they would accept that Moses was a prophet from God. They would accept that many of them believe the Israelites came through that area. But again, we cannot rely completely on tradition. If tradition is your main support, well, then that's a pretty weak case to make. But certainly Jebel al-Lawz has a tradition behind it of, the people in the area who call it, the Bedouin call it Moses' mountain. Even some of the Arab archaeologists we ran into accept that, the Israelites were here and they came through here. So that's very interesting, I think. Anyone else? Yes?
Did you actually get to go there yourself?
I did not go there. Tim Mahoney was there in 2003, and he was threatened and all his footage was stolen and so forth. So, but the last 10 years he said, oh, you have a young family, you need to stay home. So he's let me stay home while he's gone on all these adventures. So I have yet to visit the site. Yes?
What are you currently researching that you consider to be kind of a hot topic related to this?
Well, we hope to progress through the whole Bible. We're done with our Exodus-related stuff now. We're going to move on to the Covenant. A couple, probably 3 films related to the Covenant, and then we're going to move through the Judges and Kings and on to Patterns of Evidence Messiah someday. We are currently working on a film. I don't know if I can say this, but we're making a film based on Michael Medved's book called The American Miracle. And so we're going to be talking about God's providence in the founding of America. And when you look at the history, there's a lot of things where you say, that was no accident. And I think you'll be amazed when that comes out. That's due out in 2025, actually. So it's due out the year before the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. So that'll be focusing on the Revolutionary War and the Constitutional Convention in the early years of the Republic. Yes?
How is the outreach then? How has the general public taken these films?
I think a lot of people see the power of the argument. When you look at the Bible, when you go back to the Bible and look at some of these details, you say, yeah, that totally makes sense. And so I think for a long time, a lot of this idea has been growing in popularity, but a lot of the scholars are resistant to it. But I've even noticed a lot of scholars who are much more open to it now. Before they would be like, well, that's anything but that, you know, and now a lot of them are saying, well, okay, this is starting to be seen as one of the options. They might not agree with it, but they at least are giving it some credit, because a lot of people in the past would say, oh, that's a Ron Wyatt idea, and there was a lot of people who categorized it that way, and it's not a Ron Wyatt idea. It has a long history of people thinking that Mount Sinai might be in Arabia, and there's a lot of indicators in the Bible that match it. So there's no reason not to consider it a leading candidate, I think. Anyone else? Yes.
I'll mention something. A friend of mine who's a pastor, you might know him, Jim Scudder. He actually was there in December, did a 4-part series. Actually interviewed Tim Mahoney, but you can go on YouTube and look it up for free, but it's high-def video. They got the drone footage.
Yeah,
over.
I've seen a lot of good stuff coming.
So it's pretty good. I mean, you just Google "in grace,"
Okay.
Mount Sinai, and then come up with.
Yep.
So if anybody wants to see it.
Anybody else? Yes. Either one of you two guys. How about you?
Has Sodom and Gomorrah been one of those interests in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to do is once we get through with Messiah, we'll probably circle back around and hit creation and flood, and then Babel, and through Abraham, kind of. We'll end there, if the Lord allows. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting debates, hotly disputed sites for that. But there's a lot of evidence, really. I mean, there's a lot of these like sulfur balls that are across that whole region. So it's really, that's another fascinating aspect. Anyone else? Yes.
What do you think about these chariot wheels that are supposedly under parts of the Red Sea, and where are those?
Those are actually at Aqaba, at the Nuweiba crossing. And there's nothing that's been substantiated yet. There's a lot of reports of people seeing wheels, but they haven't said, okay, was that a wagon wheel from 1850 or is that a chariot wheel? Well, it looks like a chariot wheel for these. I mean, so there's possibilities or tantalizing hints, but nothing has been verified yet. So that's...
Is it really deep or something that people can't seem to get?
Yes, there's a large amount that's very deep. It's like 10 miles across. So the slope isn't the issue. It's a pretty gentle slope, but in the middle, it's really deep. It's like 800 meters deep. So it's immensely deep. So if the miracle happened there, it would have been amazing. And it probably wasn't just a narrow channel. It was probably pretty wide to allow the huge group of Israelites through. But yeah, there's still a lot of interest in what's at the bottom of the sea there. Anyone else? Yep.
Sorry, you didn't mention anything about that land, the underwater land bridge. What do you think of that? To cross the Aqaba?
Yeah, that's been claimed that it's an underwater land bridge, but that's not actually true. It is true that there's a unique saddle there. Everywhere else it just drops off in sheer cliffs, and there, the only place where it's like a potato chip. It's a nice gentle slope. At times it gets a little moderate, but it's easily traversable. So it is a unique structure, but it's not quite right to call it a land bridge because it gets really deep in the middle. But I think that fits the biblical emphasis on crossing through a deep and mighty sea with roaring waves and dozens of descriptions of emphasizing the depth of the water and the greatness of the miracle, because that's where God says this is where I'm going to make myself known, and the fear it caused in all the surrounding nations. This wasn't a swamp, on that border of Egypt. Yep.
So is that potato chip area, is that more towards the top or the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba?
It's right in the middle. So yeah, it's a unique beach actually, because it's enough room for millions of people, and that you only see that in one spot in the whole Gulf. It's like it was tailor-made a movie set for it to happen. So, and it's also a great valley, a chasm, a canyon, I'll say, that leads to this. So if they were in that, they would be trapped. They'd be lost in the wilderness. You go in, there's no way out. Pharaoh was chasing them. They'd be trapped at the sea. So it fits really well, I think. I should say that if anyone wants to leave, I think it's 8:30. If you want to leave, go, but I'm willing to stay and answer questions as long as you have questions. Anyone else? Yeah.
You mentioned one of the mountain ideas that the possibility was a volcano or volcanic action. Can you touch more on that?
What aspect?
Like why is it considered why a volcano would be helpful or not?
Well, I think Cullen Humphreys, who is the material scientist at Cambridge, he wrote a book, The Miracles of Exodus. And he goes through all the Exodus, and he shows how all the miracles could have natural explanations. And so he's saying, well, here's a mountain that the Bible's talking about smoke, it's talking about fire, the ground is shaking, fire, and people are afraid. And he goes, that's obviously a volcano, and therefore we need to look for a volcano for Mount Sinai. And there are recently active volcanoes in Saudi Arabia. There's none in the Sinai. So he just picked the one that seemed to fit. He puts actually Midian where I think it is, and he has a route that's far from Egypt, everything good. But because of his commitment that we need to explain these miracles first and foremost by natural processes, he wants a volcano. But I think there's no reason to demand that Sinai was a volcano, because it's totally consistent with the way God is described in other situations that have nothing to do with volcanoes. And we know that the Bible is talking about when they left the pillar, the fire, the glory cloud came off the mountain, and that is the pillar of cloud and fire, and that led the Israelites. So I don't see any reason to say that it had to be a volcano. Yep.
Is there any big cons to the Jebel Alaz location that you know?
In my opinion, there's not. I think it checks all the boxes. Now, some people that argue against it will say, well, it's nowhere connected with the Promised Land. It's too far away. And I would say, why is that a problem? The fact that the location of Mount Sinai was lost in history shows you it wasn't in Israel. It wasn't on the borders of Israel. Being far away from Israel fits. And we know that in Deuteronomy 1 there, where it says it's 11 days from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which is at the south end of the Promised Land. We know it was 220 miles approximately south of the Promised Land. So that puts you a great distance away. So I think traveling 15 miles a day average and gets you there, and you have to say they were traveling 3 or 4 miles a day, or else they hung out somewhere for a month twiddling their thumbs to make those mountains on the Sinai Peninsula work. And that just doesn't seem to fit the leaving in haste, traveling day and night, and being brought to Sinai on eagle's wings. That all implies a miraculous, not even miraculous, it is miraculous because of the size of the group, but it's not miraculous as far as being able to travel 15 mile a day average. That's not even what a caravan does. So yeah, I think it's a much better fit over there in Jebel Alaz, and the very things that people emphasize as being problems, I don't see as problems at all. In fact, I think that's what makes it fit the best.
We can maybe do one quick question left, and then we'll.
That graveyard, that's 21 football fields, in size. Did they do any excavating to see how some of the people were killed?
No, they have not excavated that graveyard. They did an excavation on that altar, that corridor altar, and they just looked at the surface material. They didn't go down very far at all. And they said, oh, look, that's Nabatean, which is either, right around the time of Christ, a couple centuries either way of Christ. And the Saudi archaeologists said, okay, it's Nabatean, that's the end of the story. And the archaeologists that looked at the dig report said, they didn't go more than a few inches deep. They didn't, there could be all sorts of stuff under there, and they don't know because of, and there's a great scene in the film actually where Yuri Zarin speculates about the reason behind it, like they didn't want to find anything, is basically what he was implying, So yeah, there needs to be more investigation of that site, definitely.
And that's a good point. Those DVDs are right over there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
pick up your DVDs if they run out, patternsofevidence.org.
.com.
.com?
Yep.
Okay, .com, and order them. They're great gifts. But let's give Steve a great hand.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. You did a great job.
Thank you.